Welcome to the first big section of the course. So in this section, we will learn the fundamental language of web development, which is HTML. And we're going to learn HTML by building a very small example project, where you will learn all about the most important HTML elements. So for things like creating headings, paragraphs, lists, images, links, and more. Okay? So let's go start this journey right now. Welcome back. Let's now very quickly learn what HTML actually is and what we can do with it. So basically, HTML stands for Hypertext Markup Language. And remember how we learned earlier that HTML is one of the core web technologies along with CSS and JavaScript, right? Now, HTML is a markup language that we web developers can use to structure and describe the entire content of any web page. So notice how I said markup language, because HTML is really not a programming language. It's a markup language because we use it to describe something. And in the case of HTML, we do describe content using elements. So we have different elements that we can use to describe different types of content. So for example, we have the P element that we already used in the lecture where we created our very first web page. And so we used the P element there to create a paragraph. But we really have all kinds of different elements. So elements to create links, to create page headings, images, video, and a lot more, as you will learn throughout this section and basically throughout the entire course. Then, as we also learned in that lecture where we built our very first web page, web browsers such as Google Chrome do essentially understand HTML code and can render it as a final website. So a website that we can see in the browser. Okay, so this is essentially what HTML is and what we can do with it. But now let's just zoom in a little bit and take a look at the anatomy of an HTML element. So basically, take a look at the building blocks of each HTML element. And again, we are looking at the paragraph element here, as you can see by the P. And so all of this here is actually the element itself. Now, an HTML element is usually made up of three parts. First is the opening tag, which is the name of the element. So in this case, it's the P, wrapped in the less than and the greater than symbols. Probably they have some other names, but that's how I like to call these symbols. So it's less than, P, and then greater than. Then after that, we have basically the content of the element. So in this example, that is just text, but there might be other types of content. For example, an element can contain in itself another element, which we then call a child element. Also, some elements, such as images, have actually no content at all and have only an opening tag. And all of this will, of course, become very intuitive as we start writing HTML. This is just so that you know what I'm talking about when I speak of opening tag or closing tag or content. And speaking of the closing tag, it is basically the same as the opening tag, but with a slash. So we open this paragraph element simply with the P, and we then close it with /P. Okay? Now for elements that do not have content, such as the image element that I mentioned before, we actually omit the closing tag. So in that case, we only have the opening tag and that's it. And we will see that in action, of course, once we start integrating images into a web page. Okay, and that's really all you need in order to start learning HTML in practice, which is exactly what we will do in the next lecture. Welcome back. So the first thing that we need to learn about HTML is the common HTML document structure. So a structure that each and every HTML document needs to have. But let's start by taking a very quick look at the project that we're going to build throughout this section. So we are building the code magazine. So as you can see here, and in this code magazine, we are building this very simple kind of blog post called the basic language of the web. So we have some links here, we have images, we have some bold text, we have, here you see we have some italic text, we have lists, and yeah, so there's a bunch of stuff that we will learn in this section so that by the end you will have learned the fundamentals of HTML and will end up with this project. Okay, but anyway, let's now finally get to work. And the first thing that we need to do again is to create our project folder. So let's go back to our desktop or to where you are working with your files. And what I'm going to do is to open up this folder that we just downloaded in the last section. So basically the starter code. And then I'm going to reach into this starter folder and grab a copy of the starter files here. So I will copy this folder and put it on my desktop right here. Now, instead of doing that, you could also simply go ahead and use this folder here as your project folder, but that might lead to some confusions. So I always prefer to simply copy this folder here to somewhere else. Okay, let's go back to VS Code. Can actually close this. And then let's come here to the menu and then File and open a new window. All right. And then right here, we can select Open Folder, or we can also expand the sidebar here and click on Open Folder right here. So remember that this will define our project folder. So I'm going to my desktop and then select this folder that I just created there. So open, and there we go. So we can close this one now and push this one to the left side. This panel we don't need. And then here inside of our project folder, we can, just like before, create a new file, and we will once again call it index.html. So it's just a regular file with the HTML file extension and the name of index, which should always be the main page of any website. All right. So as I mentioned before, we have some images here as our starter files and also this text file here. So let's actually also open up this file. And now I will click this icon here to collapse this sidebar to give us some more space. Okay. Now remember how in the first section we used this kind of cheat to create our HTML structure. So we wrote the exclamation mark and then tab, and that then gave us all of this structure. However, to properly learn HTML, we of course need to know how to write all of this structure on our own. And so that should always be the first thing that we learn in HTML. So we start with an empty page, and then the first thing that we need to do is to declare a so-called doc type. So just write the less than symbol, exclamation mark, and then doc type. And you see that VS Code is actually trying to autocomplete this here for us, but let's just write it all by hand so that this code basically sticks in your memory. Okay? So we have to write exclamation mark doc type HTML in order to basically tell the browser that this document uses HTML. Next up, we need to create an HTML element. So remember from the last lecture that to create an element, again, we use the less than symbol, then the name of the element, which in this case is HTML, and then we close that. And once again, VS Code automatically now closes that element for us. So it created this closing tag. Now, in case you don't want that, you can actually turn off that functionality. And let me show you how. So again, you come here to the settings, and then the name of this setting is called auto close tags. And actually, I will turn this off for now so that you can really write this code by hand instead of having VS Code helping you. So we will turn this back on a bit later, but for now, I really want you to learn how to write these elements by hand without any help. Okay, so we have the opening and the closing tag of the HTML element. And now, as for the content, we will actually put another element inside it. So let's give ourselves some space here. And then inside of the HTML, we want first a head element. So let's write it, opening, and I will then immediately close it actually, because for now we will not put any content in there. Okay, so the head and then the body. And I will explain in a second what each of these actually is. So each and every HTML document always needs to start with the HTML element like this. Then inside of this element, as we just put, we need one head element and one body element. Now, the head element is basically for things that are not visible in the browser window. So this head will contain the page title, some additional information about the page, a link to CSS files, or other things. And as we go through the course, we will fill this head with all kinds of different elements. But for now, all I want to do is to just specify the title. So let's use the title element for that. And this page I want to call the basic language of the web, HTML. So basically that's the title here of this blog post as well. Okay, and then we need the closing tag of this element. Okay. Then the body is actually for all the elements that will be visible on the page. So all the elements that we see here in the browser will always be inside of the body element. And just to show it to you, instead of leaving it empty, let me put some code here. So I will again use the heading 1 element, so h1, that we used in the very first coding lecture. And let me just grab this text from here. So that's the content, and then again, closing it. All right. Now we haven't saved this file yet, but as we do, Prettier will again format this file for us. So let's give it a save. And you see that now we have the correct indentation. And by indentation, what I mean is that since this head element, for example, is inside the HTML, it should have some space here to make that visually obvious. Okay, so basically this is just a tab here. So if I hit the tab key, then it will add another level of indentation. And so now it's at the same level as the title, which doesn't make sense because the title is also inside of the head, right? So we have the head inside of HTML, and then inside of the head, we have the title element. And so therefore, it has another level of indentation, okay? Now this is just for aesthetic reasons to make our code more readable. So the browser really doesn't care about this indentation, but it is still important for us to be able to read the code. So again, let's give it a save. And I think we are ready now to actually go ahead and open this in the browser. So let's come to our project folder and then double click index.html. And nice, here it is. Let's put it here first, close up this one. But I will also leave this demo open just so we see what we want to achieve in the end. Okay, let's close up this one here. And with this, we learned the basic structure of HTML. So let's just quickly review. So every HTML document always needs to start with the so-called doc type. And so this will let the browser know that we are actually using HTML in this file, and all browsers will then know that they should use the HTML5 specification to render this HTML. Then we have the HTML element, which is always the parent element of both the head and of the body element. So this structure is really always the same in all web pages. We always need to have an HTML element with a head and with a body. Now, what we put into the head and the body is optional, but having these two is not optional. So we always need head and body. Now, in this situation, all we put in the head is just the title element, but here we can put all kinds of other stuff that are not visible or that are not rendered here in this main part of the browser. On the other hand, the content that we actually want to be rendered here should go into the body. And so that's why having this h1 element here that then appears visible on the page. Okay, and that's it. That's the basic HTML structure for each and every HTML document that you really need to know. And with that, let's move on to the next lecture, where we will learn a couple of new elements for working with text. So I hope to see you there soon. In this lecture, we will continue learning how to mark up text. So we will keep using some headings, some paragraphs, and we will also learn how to make text bold and italic. And let's actually start with headings. So usually the goal of headings is to break up big blocks of text into more logical sections and to basically add a title to each of these sections. Now, you already learned about the h1 heading, but there are actually 6 different headings. So there's a hierarchy of headings so that we can establish a hierarchy in our text. So we can go all the way from h1 to h6. So let's grab this text here and create all of these 6 different headings, just so you can see how they look different visually in the browser. So the h1 we can call the primary heading, and then the secondary heading is the h2. And I'm pasting the exact same text here so we can see the visual difference between them. So we have h1, h2, and then for the tertiary heading, we use h3. Pasting the same text there. And now we just have to repeat all of this all the way down to h6. All right, and as you're typing these characters, so this code, all of this will start getting into your brain, and you will start getting practice writing HTML. So h6, and then let's give it a save, and then reloading the browser. And so you can see very nicely that this really created a visual hierarchy, basically, between these 6 headings. So the first one is the biggest one by far, and then this last one, which is the h6, is kind of small. And then in between, we have all these different variations. Okay, so now we know how these different headings work, but now let's take a look at our demo page, actually, just to see which kind of headings we actually need. So we have basically the name of this blog, so the code magazine, and this is the biggest heading. Then below that, we have the name of the article, so of this blog post, and this one is a little bit smaller. So it's not a primary heading anymore, but it is a secondary heading. Then inside of this text here, and remembered how I said that a heading is basically to break up text into logical sections, right? And so here in between this text, we have another section. And so here inside this, let's say, blog post, we have another heading. And so this should probably be an H3. All right. And so let's now create a markup for this kind of structure. So we have all this text that we need actually here. So we just need to copy paste this code here, or this text. All right. So I'm leaving these here for now for reference. And so remember, we are going to start with the primary heading. So I'll just paste this here and then close the H1. Okay. Then let's create our secondary heading. And again, I will grab the text from here. And so that's actually the one that we already had before. So this one is exactly the same as this one, but that doesn't really matter. It's no problem. And then let's get our H3, which is what is HTML. Let's just write that. And then let's check out what this looks like. And here we go. Nice. So this is kind of the structure of our text right now. And now we just need to fill it up with the paragraphs in between. So basically for each of these paragraphs that we have in the text, we can simply create a paragraph in the code, right? And we already used the paragraph element before. And so that's kind of a generic element that we use to mark up bigger blocks of text. So remember, that's the P element. And let me just grab the content here. So the first one that we have here is posted by Laura Jones on Monday, June 21st. Let me copy it. Oh, and you see that now this element was again closed automatically. Let's give it a save here. And now let's create some additional paragraphs here. So the P element, and let me actually close it immediately here. And then let's grab our text. So it's this one here. So copy and paste. And so by now we are starting to build really our project at the same time as learning about these elements. So this one here as well. So I'm copying it again and then pasting it inside of the P element. So let's give it a save and reload it again. And that's looking nice already. Great. Let's take a look. And now let's just grab two more. So these two paragraphs here. So after the H3 that we have down here. So P and closing it immediately as well. So just double clicking to selecting all of it, which is a nice technique. And then let's just add the final one. And you see that in the meantime, it formatted the code here. And that's because of the auto save and the auto format. Okay, now I saved it manually actually. Let's go here. And there is our content again. Now to clean this up a little bit, let's now actually get rid of all of these 6 headings here. So now you already know how they work and that they exist. And actually, instead of getting rid of them, we can use something called comments in HTML. So a comment in HTML is a way of writing some code that will not be visible in the browser. And this is very useful because it allows us to write comments about our code, or also to simply hide some code that we do not want to be rendered on the browser. Now, to write a comment, it's a little bit of a weird syntax. So again, we write the less than symbol, then an exclamation mark, then dash, dash, and then to close the comment, VS Code already automatically created this dash dash closing part. So this opens a new comment and this closes that same comment. Now, let's remove this part here. And now you see that everything turned gray. So all of this is a comment now, but we actually want the comment to end right here. So dash dash and close. And now only this part here is gray, which means that this is now the comment and it will now not be rendered. So let's check that out. And if I reload, now it is gone from the page. Nice. But we can still keep it here in the code, just so you know that H1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 also exist. Now, just one thing that I didn't mention earlier about the headings is that each and every page should only have one H1 heading. So only one primary heading. That is very important to keep in mind. This is not really mandatory, so it doesn't violate any HTML rules if we have multiple H1s, but it is a very good practice to always just have one of them. Now about all the other ones, we can have, of course, multiple of them. So, for example, I think on our page we actually have another of these headings here in the middle of our text. And so in our case, these are H3 headings. So you see, here is another one. And so, of course, we can also add that here right away. Why not? So H3, why should you learn HTML? And then, of course, closing it. Okay. Now, just to finish, let me also quickly show you how we can create bold and italic text. So here in our demo site, we have this name of the author, which is Laura Jones in bold. So how can we do that in HTML? Well, there is a special element for that, or actually two elements. And let me start with the simpler one, which is simply called B. So B stands for bold. And so the part that we want to be bold, so Laura Jones in this case, all we have to do is to put it inside of a B element. So we can just write B like this in the beginning, and then at the end of the content, we simply add our closing tag. So that's /B, close it. And now once we reload our own page, so take a look here at Laura Jones. If we reload that, then you see that it turned bold. Great. Now, however, the use of B is actually not a good practice. So B is actually an older HTML element, and starting in HTML5, we should always use the strong element instead of B. The reason for that is that B doesn't have any so-called semantic meaning. And more about that a little bit later in this section. But essentially what this means is that B is simply an element, but without a specific meaning. While on the other hand, the strong element means that this is really an important element that we want to stand out from the page. So if we say strong on the opening tag, and then of course also in the closing tag, then it will look exactly the same in the browser. So let's confirm. Yeah, it's still bold, but now it has a meaning that it is a more important text. And that is essentially the idea of semantic HTML. And again, we will talk more about semantic HTML by the end of this section. So for now, just know that don't use B, but use strong to make text bold. Now let's also make some text italic here, and let's choose this word here. So just fundamental. And just like with B, there are actually two ways of doing it. The older one is the I element. So wrapping whatever part of the text we want to be italic inside of the I element. And so I just stands for italic. And indeed, you see that now it changed. But one more time, in order to make this semantic HTML, we should no longer use the I element, but the EM element, which stands for emphasize. So we want to emphasize this text here, and that is the reason why we make it italic. So that's also the reason why the browser then shows it as italic. Right? So if we reload, it is still italic, but now we basically gave it the meaning of an emphasized text. Okay, great. This is great progress. You're doing really well up until this point. Now, just to finish this lecture, I actually already want to give you your very first small coding challenge. So what I want you to do is basically this. Let me show it to you here. So I want you to make the first letter of these words, so hypertext markup language, I want you to make the H, T, M, and L bold. All right. So basically that is this text right here. So this H, this T, this M, and this L, they should all be bold. So they should be displayed here in bold, just like I have it in the demo page. So do you think that you can do that and write some HTML code on your own for the very first time? Well, I really hope that you try it because, as I said before, these coding challenges are really, really important for you to start practicing your skills, even if it's just something really simple like this. So please go ahead and pause the video right now and make each of these 4 letters bold. And I will be back here in a second with you to show you how it's done. So, did you manage to do this? Well, this is how it works. So once again, we just need to wrap the part that we want to be marked as bold into a strong element. And in this case, that is just the H. And so that's why we're closing this strong element right here in the middle of the word. Then here we want the T. And so again, we write. And so again, a strong element here. So the opening tag, and then the other one right here. And of course, then the same for the other 2 letters. Okay, so hopefully I didn't do any mistake there. Let's reload, and there you go. HTML is now marked in bold. Great. So again, I hope that you managed to do this on your own, as this is really important for your learning process. Let's keep working with text. And in this lecture, we will learn how to create lists with bullet points and also with numbers. And what I mean by list is basically like a list of bullet points like we have here, and also like an ordered list with numbers like here with 1, 2, 3 ordered elements. All right, so that is very easy to do in HTML. So let's see how. So starting with the numbered list, so this one here, it is here at the end of this section of our text. So in the what is HTML part, so we have this paragraph, then we have this paragraph, and then we actually have another paragraph there that we missed, and then after that we have the list. So let's get all of this content. So these are the 3 list items, and that is the missing paragraph. Okay, just paste all of that here. And now I will simply wrap this element inside of a P. And so there we have the paragraph. So we have everything nicely structured here. And now let's start the list. So the element to start a ordered list, which is what a list with numbers is called, we use the OL element. So like this. And so OL stands for ordered list. And we opened it, so of course we also need to close the element. Okay, now let's give us some space here, because actually for each of the elements of the list, we need to create an element inside of the ordered list. And so for that, we use the li element, which stands for list item. So list item, open it and close it. And then let's grab this content. So the opening tag, let's cut it actually. Okay, then I'm going to cut these two as well and paste them down here. And then simply wrap it inside some more li elements. So again, li stands for list item, while ol stands for ordered list. Here I'm giving it some indentation using the tab key, just so that they are visually all aligned as child elements of the ordered list. So maybe you noticed how I'm using the terms child elements and parent elements. So whenever we have an element inside of another, basically the container of another element is the parent. So in this case, that's the ordered list. And then the elements that are inside the parent are the child elements. All right, but let's go back here and reload it. And indeed, there is our ordered list. Nice. So the Google Chrome browser understands our code and knows that it should render it as a list of ordered numbers. So 1, 2, 3. And of course, it then automatically applies these numbers without us having to do anything. And if we added another element, let's say we would even add it here at the beginning, that would then become the first element. Oh, sorry. So that would then, as I was saying, become the first element. And indeed, now we have 4 of them, and this one is the first. But this one we don't want. Let's get rid of it. Nice. So that is one of the lists. And then the other one is this one here in the why should you learn HTML part. And again, there is some other content here. So let's go ahead and grab all of this. So from this content file here. So this is the heading, and now we need all of this. Copy and paste. And so once again, I will start by wrapping these into paragraphs. And so maybe you are starting to see that we are really creating a nice and tidy structure where each piece of content is inside of some element. So we don't have like any text floating around just inside of the body without being in an element, right? We always are creating a nice structure where each element has a certain meaning. So for example, all of these are of course paragraphs, and that's why we use the P element. And this piece of content here is a list, and that's why we use the ordered list element. And so that is essentially to assign some meaning to the content and to structure it in a logical way. And so this then allows web browsers to display it in a way that makes sense. But anyway, now we have this content here, which we want in this kind of list, like bullet points here. And so the element that we use for that is UL. And UL, maybe you can guess, stands for unordered list. All right, let's close it down here. UL. And so an ordered list with the numbers is OL, and the one without numbers, which we say is unordered, because the order of the elements does not matter. So that is then called UL, which stands for unordered list. But then inside of the list itself, we still have to use the li element for the individual items. So just like before, we need to wrap all of these different pieces of content into an li element. So we already did that before, so I'm sure you know how to do it. And maybe you saw it coming that this is another very small coding challenge for you. So pause the video now and do exactly the same thing that we did up here. So wrap each of these items in an actual li element. And so like this, you can keep practicing writing some HTML on your own. Okay, so I hope that was a simple challenge. And so let's quickly do it here. All right. So this one here actually has multiple lines, so it ends here. And you see that the formatting here is completely wrong, but I'm not worrying about that, because for that we have the helper tool of Prettier, right? So Prettier takes care of all our formatting. But hopefully you see that without that formatting, this looks like a complete mess, right? It's very hard to understand. So for example, this element here is not a child element of P. So it should be aligned here. And we could do that manually, of course, simply by deleting this space, but we can also just leave it to Prettier once we save the file. Sorry. And here I'm missing the closing slash. And now, as I was saying, as I save the file, then Prettier does its magic and nicely formatted here our elements. Now we also have this empty paragraph here for some reason. So maybe I did some mistake here earlier. So let's just delete it and save it again. And now, as we come here to our page, then indeed we have our nice unordered list down here. Great. So creating lists is another important part of writing HTML. We use this all the time. And so I hope that you had fun with this lecture, because it was quite an important one. So before you move on, please make sure to review what we just did here, and also think a little bit about some of the things I said earlier, such as the fact that each element has a different meaning, and also that we need to use these elements to structure our content. So we cannot simply just dump all of our text here into the body text and call it a day. So if we did that, there would be no structure and no logic at all. So I just deleted some empty paragraph here, but I just wanted to show you what happens if I select all of this. So copy paste here basically. So if I take it and just paste it down here. So give it a save, and well, you see that it's now all one big blob of text, and HTML doesn't really care about any white space. So any of these line breaks here, they're all irrelevant to HTML. And so if we try to load this, you see that there is no structure at all. So everything is just one huge line of text, and yeah, that's it. There's no structure, there is no meaning, there's nothing, basically. And so I hope that this small example showed you the importance of basically wrapping all pieces of content inside of an element that actually gives that content some meaning. Okay, but with that, I'm leaving you, and I see you soon in the next video. One thing that our blog post is still missing right now is some images. And so let's now learn how to use the HTML image element. So if we check out the demo page, then we notice that here we have two kind of important images. So we have this big image here, which kind of illustrates the blog post. And then we also have this photo here of the author. And so let's now start by incorporating this image here into our blog. So the images are, of course, in our project folder. So they came with the starter files. And the one that we are going to include here is this post image. So you see when you double click, so when you open this file, then VS Code is actually able to display image files without any problems. So we want this image right here after this author. So basically the image serves as a barrier between the beginning of the article and the rest of the page, so the top part. Now, I think that here actually this title here, so this h2 element should be before the author. So let's move that down here. Right, so first, of course, like we have it here, needs to come the actual title, so the heading element, and only then the author, and then this image here. Okay, but anyway, let's now include the image element. So again, right here after this paragraph, we want to include this image. So, just like any other element, we start by writing it like this. But now remember how I actually told you in the first lecture of this section that the image element is a special element. And that's because it doesn't have any content. And therefore, it also doesn't have a closing tag. Instead, what we do is to simply add this slash here at the very end of the element. Now, you might wonder, if we don't specify any content here for this image element, then how will HTML know which element it should display? And that is an excellent question, which brings us to something new in HTML, which are attributes. So attributes are basically pieces of data which we can use to describe elements. So there are lots of different attributes in HTML, and one of them is the source attribute. And so that's the one we are interested in right now. So source goes like this, src, and then an equal, and then we need double quotes like this. And then here we can simply specify the name of the image. So remember that is post image.jpg. And so we just write post image. And we could even allow VS Code to autocomplete that code for us, like by clicking here or going down. And actually that didn't work. But if we just hit enter here, then that would work just fine. So again, we can write it manually or just use VS Code's autocomplete functionality. And that's actually it. That's the very basics that we need in order to display an image. So if we reload this now, you will see that indeed, here it is. Great. So again, let's just quickly recap. We did not specify the image using some content in this element. Instead, what we needed to do was to specify an attribute. And in this case, it's the source attribute. And remember that an attribute is basically like a piece of data, so a piece of information describing this element. So here we are describing the source from which the browser should basically read the image. All right. Now, besides the source attribute, there are other attributes that we can specify for images. And one that we should never skip is the alt attribute. So we write it like this, and alt stands for alternative text. So basically what we need to specify here is some text that should describe what the image is about. And this is very important for various reasons. One of them is that it will allow search engines such as Google Chrome to actually know what is in the image. Because without this description, search engines don't really have a know of knowing what the image is actually about. And second, and probably even more important, is that by specifying the description of the image, we can also allow blind people to use our website. So users who use a screen reader will not see the image, but instead they will have the screen reader read the alternative text, so the description, to them. So never skip this attribute. It's very important to always write a good description. So here let's say that this image here is HTML code on a screen. Okay, now this will not visually change actually what we see here. So let's reload. Unless the image for some reason cannot be found. So let's say that we forgot the G here, for example. And so now this image path is completely wrong. So if we now reload, then the browser will not be able to find the image. But instead, what it will do is to then print our description here. So that's the HTML code on the screen that we gave it here. Okay, so that is actually another use case of the alt text. Let's put it back. And we are actually still not done. So we can specify some more attributes here, which are quite important in this case. So the ones that I mean are the image width and the image height. So right now this image here is a little bit too big. And so let's specify its width to 500 pixels. And don't worry yet about what these 500 pixels mean or exactly what a pixel is. We will talk more about that once we reach the CSS section. But for now, let's just write width and set it to 500. And then let's see. Okay, so now it scaled the image to a width of 500, and it automatically also maintained the aspect ratio of the image. All right, but we can also specify that. So besides the width, we can also specify the height, which should be 200. And I know that because I know the image dimensions. So if we open this up again, you see here that the original image is 1000 by 400. And so if I specify the width as 500, which is just half of 1000, then the height must also be half of 400 here. So that would be 200. Okay, so that should now look the same, and it does. But of course, if I wanted, I could make it a square, for example, which would then completely distort the image just as we see here. Of course, we don't want that. So put it back, and here we go. Great. So this is how we include images into an HTML document. And this one here was only the first one that we wanted. The other image is this author image right here above this author paragraph right here. So the image that we want now is this one, Laura Jones. And we want it with a height and a width of 50 pixels. Okay, so I have another challenge for you. And what I want you to do this time is to include this image that I just showed you on your own right here in this place. Okay, so take a minute and pause the video and include this image with 50 by 50 pixels. And then I'll be back here in a minute with the solution. All right, so hopefully you got some more practice there. So image, and I will immediately start writing the attributes, and I will then in the end close the element. So here we want Laura Jones, and now I will just hit enter or return to autocomplete the file name here. And then the alt text, let's say that this is a head shot of Laura Jones and not Jonas, and a height. And here again, we could now hit enter or return to autocomplete this, but I actually want you to write these attributes by yourself, by hand, so that they get into your head. So that's really important. So a height and a width of 50, and that's it. So let's close the element, give it a save, and then Prettier does this nice job of putting each of these attributes here in one line, which makes it really easy to see. Actually, let's close down our sidebar here. And let's see. And here we go. So here is that picture of Laura Jones now. Okay, well done. Nice progress. So now we know how images work and how attributes work as well. And actually, we can specify attributes also on some other elements in HTML. And one where this is very important is actually the HTML element itself. So here in this HTML element, we should specify the language that we use for this web page, so for this document. And we can do that by saying lang, so specifying the lang attribute. And then in this case, since it is English, we can set it to en. But for other languages, there are other codes. For example, for German, it is probably de, or for Portuguese, it should be pt. And if you have any other language, you can just easily find out the code by Googling. Another thing that we can and actually should do, which needs attributes, is to specify the character set that is used in the document. So that is something that goes into the head because it is a piece of information that describes the document. So here we need another new element. This is simply called meta, which stands for metadata. So metadata means data about the data. And so here we are describing that the character set, which we describe by this attribute. So we say that the character set should be UTF-8, which basically is all the simple characters that we use in the English language. Now this one here is another of these elements that doesn't have a closing tag, and so we just close it like this. Okay, now I'm not spending a whole lot of time on these elements and on this kind of stuff, because later when you actually build your own pages, then this will all happen automatically. Okay, so this was just to show you that this is just another way or another place in which we need some attributes where we then need to specify a value for it. All right, so UTF-8 here is the value that we specified for this character set attribute. Okay, and yeah, I think that's it for this lecture. So see you in the next one. One of the fundamental building blocks of the internet are hyperlinks, or for short, just links. So links are what actually enables the internet to be a World Wide Web. So without links between pages, there would be no web. And so let's now learn how to place links on our own web pages. Now we can place links into two big categories. The first category is links that point to other pages within our own website. So let's say that here in our website, the Code magazine, we had another blog post. So we could then create a link from this page to that other page, right? Now, on the other hand, the other category is links that point to outside of our website. So for example, if I placed a link to udemy.com here on this page, then that, of course, would be a link to the outside of our website, right? Now, we do create these two types of links in the exact same way in HTML, but there's still some kinds of particularities that we need to be aware of. And so let's now actually start with the second kind of link that I was describing, which point outwards of our own website. So what I have here in the demo is that here at the end of this part, so of this what is HTML section, I have a link to the MDN web docs. So this is basically a website where you can learn all about HTML and also CSS and JavaScript. And actually, I will show you this site a little bit better in the next section, because it's important as a web developer to know how to use and find information here in this web documentations page. So what we want is to grab the link of that. And so to do that, just Google MDN, which stands for Mozilla Developer Network, and then just HTML. And the exact URL that we're going to use here doesn't really matter. All we want is to have some URL that points outside of our own page, right? So let's just grab this one here, which was the first Google result. So I'm copying it. And again, keep in mind that this is called a URL. So as you know, every single website on the internet has its own URL. And so that is what we need in order to create a link to that page. Okay, so let's see. Yeah, we want to put that right here after this unordered list, right? Let's see in the demo. Yeah, so right here after the ordered list. So that's here. So to create a link in HTML, we use the A element, which stands for anchor. So technically, a hyperlink or a link is actually called anchor in HTML. So it is an anchor element. We can close it. Then we can specify some content, and then we can, or we have to actually close it. So let's start by doing that. Now, as for the content of the link, what we specify here is actually the text that we want to be displayed on the page. So the text of the link. So in this case, that is this MDN web docs. All right, so MDN web docs. But now, what about the URL where we want this link to point to? Well, for that, we need to once again use an attribute. So in this case, it is the href attribute. Then equal, double quotes, and then we can simply paste that URL that we copied right here. And that's actually it. So if I give it a save now, and then reload our page here, then here is our link. And you see it down there, so here in this corner, that when I hover it, it actually shows me the URL. And then when I click it, our page goes there. Great. And so that is actually already the basics of creating a link. Very simple, right? Now we want this link here to actually be like inside of this text. So inside of one more paragraph here, right? So let's create that paragraph. So you can learn more at, and then this link here is basically just a continuation of the text in here. So inside of this paragraph. So we can finish our sentence here and then close up our paragraph as usual. And so now that looks just like in the original one, right? Now notice what happens here once again when I click it. So you see that we navigated directly to this page, and now our own page disappeared. So of course we can go back here, but sometimes what we want to do is to open a link in a new tab. So let me also show you how we can do that. And of course we don't always want that. So many times we actually want the page to really move to the URL that we specified here, but also sometimes it's useful to keep the page open and simply open the URL in a new tab. And we can do that by specifying the target attribute, then the quotes as always, and then this one looks a bit weird. So it's underscore and then blank. So give that a save, and when we reload, it will look the same, but the behavior should have changed. And indeed, notice how it opened a new tab, and our original one is still open. Great. So that worked. And so we have now a link that points to a URL that is outside of our own website. But now about that first scenario where we want to link to an internal page, basically. Let's do that now. And going back again to our demo, we have here this example. So in the very beginning, right after the main heading, we have these links here. And so these are supposed to be links that point to pages that are part of this blog. So let's now create this first link here, so blog, and also create a new page where we can actually link to. Okay, and so creating a new page is as simple as creating a new HTML document. So let's open up again our sidebar by clicking here, and then we see our Explorer here basically with all the files. And then again, we create a new file in this icon here, and let's call it blog.html this time. And now we could use this cheat here to create the HTML structure, but actually let's practice a little bit here again. And if you want, you can even pause the video and type it out on your own. but I will just do it here very fast now. So HTML, then we need to close it, of course. Now inside of the HTML, remember we have the head. Inside of the head, we have a title usually. And this one, let's just call it like this, blog. So just uppercase to make it really obvious. And you see that this is really just a very bare bones structure, just a head with a title. And actually the same for the body, which remember is the part that is going to be visible in the browser. So here I will simply specify an h2 element and close it also here. And let's call this one blog as well. Okay, we still need to close the body, of course. And that's it. Let's give it a save. And so here we have a very simple, very bare bones block HTML document. But now with that in place, we can create a hyperlink or a link right here in this index.html, which will point to that blog.html. And so the browser will then navigate to that page. So let's do it right here after the h1. And so the anchor element, then we need the href. And so now what we do here, instead of specifying a URL, is to specify the name of the HTML file that we want to go to. And so in this case, it is of course this blog.html that we just created. Then here as the content of the element, let's just write blog again, and then close it as always. Give it a save. Here is our beautiful link. And now watch what happens as I click it. Bam, we are now at blog. And you can see that also here in the URL bar. So which is now all of this file. And so all of this path. And then at the end, blog.html. Right? Now to go back, we could of course click here on this back button. But what we could also do is to add a link here, which simply points back to index.html, right? That sounds like a nice idea, doesn't it? So let's come back here to blog.html, and as yet another challenge, now I want you to actually create this link on your own. So pause the video here and create a link that points back to index.html. So, did you manage to do that? Or at least try it? Well, I sure hope so. But anyway, of course we use the A element again, then we specify href, and well, to go back, we just say index.html. And then here we can specify any text, which I didn't tell you which one, because it doesn't really matter. Let's just say back to home or something like that. Give it a save. And now once we reload it, we have our link, we can click it. And so now we can basically go back and forth between these two pages because they're now connected through these links. So we can go to the blog, we can go back and forth, and so on and so forth. All right. So let's close up this one here. We don't need it anymore. And just to finish, we can also actually specify a link that doesn't go anywhere. So let me show that to you as well. So let's just write the content first. And here I have challenges, I think, in the demo. So we have challenges, Flexbox, and CSS Grid. So that's challenges. But watch what happens now when I reload the page like this. So you see that it only says challenges, but notice how it's just normal text. It's not blue and not underlined, so it's clearly not a link, right? So even though it is actually an anchor element. But what makes an anchor element really a link is the href property. And so we really need to specify it. Otherwise, it is not a link at all. It is then just an anchor, which is not really useful. Now, but what if we don't want this to point anywhere, as I was saying? Well, the solution to that is to specify this hash symbol right here, right? So if I now save it and reload, then we are back to this being a link, actually. It just doesn't point anywhere. What happens when you click on this link is that basically it goes back to the top of this current page, okay? And a little bit later in the course, we will actually make use of this behavior. But for now, I just want you to know that this is how we can specify links when we don't have any URL yet for them or don't have any page. So basically, this is like a placeholder link. Okay, and so let's just copy this here twice. There's no need to write it again. But of course, if you want, you can write it again. So just for this flexbox in CSS grid. So just to make that navigation look a bit more like complete. But all of these links, they should not point anywhere. Okay, and this is how you specify links or hyperlinks or anchors, as we can also call them, in HTML. So this is a really important part of the web, as I said in the very beginning. And so make sure that you understand how they work and how we place them inside our own web pages. So we already learned a couple of very important HTML elements and are already able to create a nice page with some nice functionality as well. But now it's time to actually add some structure to our document and to our elements. And so let's now learn a couple of new HTML5 elements for that. Now, when I said that the page is lacking some structure, what I meant is that all of these elements that we placed in our document, they're all simply like appearing one after another here, right? They're not really like distinguished from one another, and especially they're not like grouped together in any logical way. And so let's change that by creating some container elements which will then group these elements together. So one of the things that first come to mind is these links here. So we have all of these links, and this kind of looks like a page navigation here, right? So a page navigation is usually what we want when we have a couple of links at the top of a page. And so what we can do is to specify a special element and then place all the links into that element. And the element that I mean is called nav. So nav, which stands for navigation. So just like this. And now these need to be indentated, or they should be at least. And so when I give it a save, then Prettier formats this automatically. And now these four links are nicely grouped into this container here. So into this parent element, which is a navigation. Now, the thing is that when we now update our page, it does look exactly the same. So all that happens here is that this basically created like an invisible box, which now contains these elements. Okay, so the element on itself doesn't do anything. All it does is to group these elements together. And I understand that right now it doesn't really seem intuitive or logical to be doing this, but trust me, once we reach the section where we build some layouts, and actually also in the next section just on CSS, it will be very important to have all these different parts inside of their own containers. All right. So looking at our page, basically this is now the navigation, and this here is the heading. Then after that, we have all of this here, which is basically our post, so our blog post, right? So this is kind of different than this top part. So all of this is the blog post again, and this is like the top part of our web page. So what we can do is to group this navigation and the heading into a header element. All right, so let's do that. So this is another HTML5 element, which is called header. And the header basically means the top part of a web document, or it can also mean the top part of some smaller unit, as we will actually see in a minute. And anyway, this is just an introduction to these HTML5 elements. We will use them even more, and I will explain them even more when we build our big website project a little bit later in this course. Okay, so again, nothing will have changed visually, but now we told the browser, like, hey, all of this here is our web page header. So it's the top part of our page. Then all of this, as I mentioned before, starting here is the main part of the page, which is in this case a blog post. And a very common element that we can use for a blog post is the article element. So this is yet another container element, but this time it's one for an article. An article in this context actually does not simply mean a written article like this, but it can also be like things from the real world. Like a computer is an article, or a pen, or a phone. So all of these are articles, and if somehow we needed to represent a computer in HTML, then an article would also be a good element for that. Okay, and so now basically our body has only two direct child elements. We only have a header and we have an article, which is, when we look at our page, really all we have. So we have the header and we have all of the rest, which is our article. So that is now nicely placed inside of its own box. Now, one thing that you might ask, well, if these boxes, all of them don't do anything, then why don't we call all of them just nav, or all of them header, or all of them article? So this one could also be article and nothing would change on the page, right? However, we don't do that for something called semantic HTML, and I will explain briefly what that means in the next video. But now, continuing even further, we can actually do some more grouping here inside of our article. So notice how we have kind of this top part here of the article. So basically the heading, the author here, and also the image. So this is kind of the top part of our article. And then here we have the content itself, right? And so once again, notice how I said that this is like the top part of the article. So just like this here is the top part of the entire web page. So what that means is that here again, we should use a header element to basically mark that up. And by marking up, I mean to basically describe the content in a better way. So as I just said, inside of the article, we want to also have a header. So inside of that header, there should be this heading, this author image, the author name, and then here this image. Okay, and then closing it. Now all of this is of course a little bit subjective as well. So what seems very logical here to me might not be as logical for other developers. But I think that what we just did here up until this point is quite logical for everyone and makes sense. So again, this one here is the header part of the article. And with this, we gave our article a little bit more structure. So we have the header, and only after that, then comes the rest of the content. Okay, so this is looking quite nice already. But finally, if we look at our demo here, there's actually one thing missing. And in fact, there's multiple things. So we don't have these related posts yet, but we will take care of that later. But we also have this part here at the bottom. So it's this copyright notice here. And this kind of content that comes at the very end of a page is what we usually call the footer. And so there's actually, as you might have guessed, a special element for that as well in HTML5. So footer And then let's close it also, like this. And now let's grab actually the text from here. Actually, it's not here. So we have to just write it manually. And now here we have two options. So to write this text, we could create a paragraph and then put that text in there. Or we could actually also write the text right here into this footer. Okay. And this is, in fact, what I will do now. So in this case, there is just no need here to create yet another paragraph, because it's going to be the only child of this footer element here anyway. And so there's no need then. So copyright. And now here you see this copyright symbol, which I'm sure you know. So how do we create that? Well, this is something called an HTML entity. So actually this is something new. So let me show you quickly how we do that. So we write an ampersand like this. And then in this case, I already know the name of the character that I want. So I can just start writing copy. And so then I can select this one here, or I can just write the semicolon, and then we're done. So this HTML entity here is what represents this C here. Okay. And there are entire tables for HTML entities, and I have one on my resources page. I think I haven't mentioned that resources page yet, but there is a link to it in the very first text lecture in the first section, and also in the GitHub repository that I showed you in one of the first lectures. And there you will find a link to a page which contains all of these HTML entities. But anyway, we will talk a little bit more about this later in the course anyway. The code magazine. Okay, so written in the future. Give it a save. And once again, let's reload. And as we were expecting, the visual aspect of the page is still the same as I mentioned at the beginning. So these again are just important to group the content into logical parts, which is important for semantic HTML and also for styling with CSS, as you will see in the next section. And speaking of semantic HTML, that is going to be the topic of our next video. So I hope to see you there very soon. So I mentioned the term semantic HTML a couple of times in this section. And so let's now actually very quickly define what I actually mean by semantic HTML. So in HTML, when we talk about semantics, what we mean is that certain elements have actually a meaning or a purpose attached to them. So when we think about a certain HTML element, we should actually not think about what that element looks like as it's rendered on the page, but instead we should think about what that element actually means and what it stands for. So that is basically the definition of semantic HTML. Now, not all elements in HTML are semantic, and actually I talked a little bit about that before here in this element. So the strong element, which makes our element look bold here on the page. So remember how previously I used the B element, which simply turns its content bold, but doesn't attach it any meaning, right? So I explained that before, and so now maybe it makes a bit more sense. So again, by using the strong element here, the text will still look bold here in the browser, but what really matters here is that we now assign some meaning to this content here. We now say that it's a strong content, which means basically a very important piece of content. And the same here for this piece. So this fundamental word here. So again, we use EM for emphasizing this. And so it still looks italic here on the web page, but what we really mean is that we emphasized this word here. So we gave it a special emphasis, and yeah, that's what this element here right now means. Okay, and the same is actually true for all of these elements that we used in the last video. So for example here, this navigation element. All this does is to create a box, remember, which then contains these 4 anchor elements, but visually it doesn't really do anything. All this does is to represent as a meaning that this is a navigation. But instead of using nav, we could also have used a more generic element, which is the div element. So for example, div, open and close it here. And again, visually, nothing will change. And so all this did was to create a new box, but a box without any meaning. So that's what div stands for. So back in the day, before HTML5, we always used divs for every single box that we needed like this on the page. But then HTML5 came around and introduced this concept of semantic HTML. And so now we should only use the div element when we don't want to attach a certain meaning to a certain container. So to a certain like box element on our page. So in this case, we really want this to mean that it's a navigation. And so we use the navigation element for that. Okay, and the same is true for the article, the header, the footer that we have down here. And in fact, it is true even for the paragraph, for example. Because all that this paragraph here and all the other paragraphs really are essentially boxes filled with text. Now the P, of course, does have a semantic meaning. It means that it is a paragraph. But we could, again, use a generic box without any meaning, so this div, and nothing would change visually. Okay, actually something did change here, so we lost some of the white space that we do have around the P. All right, so let's put it back here anyway to the P, because we want it to have some meaning. And of course, we also want the spacing that the browser gives us by default around the P elements. Okay, but the idea that I mentioned still holds, because we could very easily recreate this space here using some CSS later. So if we wanted, we could in fact build the entire web page only out of div elements if we wanted, and then use CSS to style them as we want. But of course, we don't do that. We use semantic HTML to give our elements meaning. Now, you might ask why we actually do that, and there are multiple reasons. And I think I mentioned them already, actually. So one of them is search engine optimization, which basically means that search engines such as Google will be able to understand the structure of your content, and therefore they will be better able to analyze what your content and what your web page is all about. Also, writing semantic HTML is extremely important for accessibility, and especially for people who rely on screen readers to consume our web pages. Okay, so I hope that this makes sense, and we will also keep touching on this subject as we go through the rest of the course. But I still wanted to make it very clear from the very beginning that when we think about HTML, we should not only think about how it actually looks like in the browser, but even more about what these elements actually mean and what they stand for. And with that being said, we kind of finished all we had to learn in this section. And so in the next video, we will configure VS Code a little bit more, and then we will move on to 2 final challenges in this section. So don't wait, and let's move on to the next lecture here. Welcome back. So we started configuring our VS Code editor in the very beginning of the course, but now at this point we are ready to install 3 additional extensions that will make our lives a little bit easier as we code HTML and CSS. And so let's head over to our extensions panel here. And the first extension that I want to install here is called Image Preview. So it's this one, and I already have it installed. So I just need to click on Enable. Okay, so that's the first one. And what this one is going to do is that here in our HTML, it now displays the small image preview here in this gutter, as it's called. So here we have this one, and then this image here is also right here where we declare it. So where we include it in our code. And this can be extremely helpful sometimes. So that's why I really wanted to show you this one. The next one that I want to show you is called color highlighter or highlight. So it's this one here. And again, I already have it installed. I just enable it. And actually this one I cannot show you yet what it looks like because it will only be relevant in CSS. But trust me that this extension is really, really helpful for visualizing colors in CSS. Next up is an extension called auto rename tag. So this one, and you see it's an extremely popular one once again. So you have to download it and enable it. And then what happens here is that when we change the name of an element, let's say we actually wanted to make this one a div, then you see it automatically also changes the closing one. So the closing tag. Okay. And this again is extremely helpful and makes our life writing HTML a bit easier. Because trust me, we need to do this all the time, like changing the element name. Okay. Now, another thing that we need to do, or at least that we can do if we want, is to go back to our settings and then turn back on this setting that we deactivated at the beginning of this section. So that's the auto, let's spell that right. So auto close tag. So let's enable this back because I think at this point you will no longer make the mistake of forgetting a closing tag. And so now we can allow VS Code to do that work for us. So for example, if we wanted to write a paragraph here, then now you see HTML automatically closed that element for us. Okay, but this we don't need. And now we are going to install the most important and the most useful one of all. And that is called Live Server. So it's this one here, Live Server with almost 12 million downloads. And this one is popular for a reason. So I just click enable here. And so when I go now to my HTML, and let's close this one down. So close down the sidebar. Now down here in this bar, we should have now this Go Live button. Okay. So hopefully after installing this Live Server extension, you can also see this button down here in this status bar. So when I now click this, then it's starting and we get this message that server is started at this port number here. Let's close that. And you see that it opened a new tab which contains our page, right? So basically it looks exactly the same, but there is one very big difference. So let's say we want to change this here. And I'm going to call it Jonah's code. And now look closely what happens here as I save this file. So I hit Command S now, or Control S on Windows. And you see what happened? It automatically reloaded the page without us having to do anything. So all we did was save the code. And what will then happen is that this page here gets automatically updated. So all the changes that we did here will basically get injected into this page. And yeah, we can then see the reflection of our changes immediately. So I put it back now, hit again Command or Control S to save it. And immediately you see it going back to what it was before. Now, if we wanted to stop this connection once we are done developing, all we have to do is to click down here on this icon here where it says port 5500. And by the way, this port number is exactly what we have here. Okay, so just for the sake of curiosity, this one here means that it's a local host server. So basically it's like you have now a web server on your own computer running, and then we have actually this code running at this port number. And so this port, it's basically like a sub address of your web server, so of the local host server. But this doesn't really matter. What matters is that this now works, and it is really, really helpful for our development workflow. Now, if for some reason you could not make this work on your computer, then of course don't worry. So you can still do it the old way. So basically the way we have been doing it all along up until this point. So you can just open up the file from your file system like we did, and then keep refreshing it manually, right? But we right now no longer need this tab here because we now have our live connection. So we have our live server serving up this page here whenever we do some edits. All right, and with that, we are now ready to tackle our final last 2 coding challenges in this HTML fundamentals section. Now it's time for the first big coding challenge in this course. So let's get started. Now, before we start with the actual challenge, I want to first make some changes to the file structure that we have in this project right now. And in particular, what I want to do is to put all the images into one folder so that I can then show you how we can include the images like this when they are located in a specific folder. So right now, they are all, as we can see here, they're all in the exact same folder as the index.html. And so that's why all we have to do is to declare the name here, and the browser will then find them basically in the same folder as the HTML document. But now let's create a new folder by clicking this icon, and I'm going to call it img. And then I'm going to put all of the images there. So just dragging and dropping them like this. Okay. And so now if we reload the page, and not this one, which is our demo, but the one we're working on. And by the way, this time I had to actually manually reload the page because I had my computer turned off in the meantime. And so whenever you do that, the very first time you come back, you will have to manually reload the page here when you are running the live server extension. Okay, so remember that we installed that in the last video. And so if I do some change here now, then that should probably just work just before. So you see there's some change, and there it appeared. But anyway, you see that now that we have these images inside of the img folder, they are no longer found in the same folder as index.html. So that's why they don't appear up here. So what we need to do here is to change the path to the image now. And that's not a difficult problem. All we have to do is to start a new path with the name of the folder. So that's img and then /. And so here we go. So you see the image appears here now again in this gutter. And so let's do the same thing here. Give it a save. And here are our images back. Okay, so usually we always put the images in a separate folder. And so I thought that was important to show you, especially now before this challenge where we are going to use some more images. So about the challenge, I'm being here back in the demo page. And so essentially what I want you to do is to code on your own this part here. All right. And let me actually show you where that should be in our markup. So in our HTML. And it is right here after the article. Okay. So this section here about the related posts is no longer part of the article. it's also not part of the footer, and so here we will need another element. And this one I will actually write for you. So here we are going to use the aside element. And the aside element is usually used for some secondary information that complements the information in the main part of the page. So in this case, the main part of the page is the article, and then the aside, which is secondary information, is basically some related posts that are related to the article, so to the main part. Okay? Now visually, many times we use the aside element as a sidebar, but it doesn't have to be that way. Okay, but now about the challenge itself. So you see that it starts here with this heading. So you can experiment which heading is best here. So one of the headings, H1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, remember. And then here you see that this is actually a list, right? You can see that because of these bullet points. And so here for this part, you should probably use a list. Now, what we didn't do before was to have multiple elements inside of one list item. So up here, for example, we have the list item, and in there, there's only some text. But you see that here in each item, there's an image, a link, and then some more text here. And that's no problem at all. So inside of each list element, there can be multiple other child elements, right? And so with that information, I think you are now able to build this. Now, finally, just about the images here, that's some more information that you need. They are also in this folder, and they are called related 1, 2, and 3. And the dimensions I want you to give them is 75 by 75 pixels. And now I think I gave you everything, so please pause the video now and take a couple of minutes, 10, 15 minutes maybe, to write up the HTML for this section. So good luck with that, and I see you once you're ready. All right. So hopefully you did this just fine. So let me show you how I did it. And I hope that you start to see how helpful it is that VS Code now automatically closes or HTML elements, right? So the source here is in the IMG folder, and then related 1. Then the alt text, let's just say that this is a person programming. And of course, your alt text doesn't have to be exactly the same as mine. So if your alt text is a bit different, that is not a problem at all. And now we need to close it as well. And so that's the image part. Next, we have a hyperlink, so an anchor tag. And here, the href, which is something that I didn't mention, but hopefully you figured it out, that this is one of the links that should not point anywhere for now. So how to learn web development. And now finally there's some text with the author there. And so we can use a paragraph for that. So by Jonas Schmettmann. Okay, giving it a save. Now it's nicely formatted and it should appear down here. And indeed, here it is. Great. Oh, I'm just missing here the heading actually. So let me go back and put that even before the unordered list. So I'm using an H4 for that. But anyway, let's continue now building our list here with the next list item. And by the way, if you did your code a little bit different from mine, that's really not a problem. What matters here is that you tried writing the code on your own. That is really the most important thing that I was expecting you to do here. So with 75 the height also 75. Then again, a link pointing nowhere. And this one is the unknown powers of CSS. And by Jim Dillon. And I'm not going to check out the result just yet. Let's just finish it. So another image. So the goal of this part here was really to have you practice writing this same code, basically, or very similar code over and over again, because this is the only way that this stuff really gets into your brain. So let's call this one JavaScript code on a screen. And again, the width of 75 and the height of 75. And you notice I'm writing this a little bit faster right now because we don't want to waste a lot of time writing this repetitive code. This was really just for you to practice. Is awesome. Finally, the paragraph. Give it a save. And beautiful. So this looks just like in our demo. And we have now all this content that we want to display here nicely marked up in a very logical way. So you might be wondering why we used a list here in this case. And the reason for that is basically the idea behind semantic HTML that I explained a little bit earlier. So if we think about these related posts, we can very easily argue that it is essentially a list of related posts, right? And so if it is a list, we should mark it up in our HTML. So we should write our HTML as a list. And so that's just what we did. Later with CSS, we will then remove these bullet points because they don't make a lot of sense in this context. But even with the bullet points removed, we still want the meaning of this element, so of all of this here, to be a list. But anyway, that's enough for this video. So I really hoped that you completed this challenge and that you enjoyed doing it, even if it took some time. And even if you had to review some concepts from the previous lectures. That's completely normal, and that's exactly how it should be, actually. Now, in order to practice a little bit more even, there is another coding challenge coming up, which is completely detached from this project. But it's a really exciting one, so I hope to see you there soon. Time for another exciting coding challenge so that you can keep practicing your new HTML skills. And in this one, I want you to build this component for this Converse All-Star shoe. And I'm saying component here because I want you to imagine this content here in the context of something like an e-commerce store. So imagine that we have a shoe store and there are multiple shoes. And for each of them, there is then like the small component with this description. So stuff like the price, a short description, a link, and then some product details here. Now I am building this component, so I'm writing this HTML on a special coding platform called codepen.io. So this is a place online where we can basically write our code and it will then automatically execute the code and render it, and it makes it also easy to share that code. Now, of course, you don't need to use CodePen in order to complete this challenge. You can just go to your code editor and, for example, add a brand new HTML file here, and then build all the code in there. The reason why I'm not doing that here in the video is because we're actually going to build on this challenge later. So we will keep developing this very small project over the next few sections, and that would then create a mess of different files and a lot of different code. But of course, because you're doing it on your own computer, it's easier for you. And so you can just, as I said, if you want, create a new HTML file and do it here. But on the other hand, I think it's also helpful and useful for you to learn a little bit about CodePen.io and create the challenge there. So let me just give you a very quick demonstration of CodePen. So just Google CodePen, I would say, or you can go to CodePen.io. And then all you have to do is to click here on Start Coding. Now, maybe in the future, something has changed about CodePen, so about this interface, but you will always be able to create a new CodePen simply by going to codepen.io/pen. So just like this. So here we basically have a panel where we can write HTML, CSS, and JavaScript if we want, or we can also just collapse these panels if we don't need them, which is the case right now. And so here we can write our HTML. Let's just write an H1 element, hello world, for example. And you see that here we have to, again, manually close the element. But anyway, you see that after some time, it then renders the results down here. So in this results panel, basically. You can also change the name of your CodePen. So let's say challenge 2, which is the name of this lecture. Okay, and then you can also save it. Now to save it, you will have to create a free account, but I would say that it's actually worthwhile to do so. But of course, it's optional and you are not forced to create a new account here. But if you do, that is actually very helpful because then you will get a special URL for each CodePen, and then you can share that CodePen with others. So if you want to just like create a quick example, a quick demo of something to show it to someone, then you can just come to CodePen, create it right here, and then copy paste the URL from here once you have saved it. And by the way, what I just described is actually also the best way of sharing code in the Q&A section on Udemy in case you run into any problems. Okay, so again, it would probably be a good idea to create an account here because it's just useful and many programmers use CodePen. It's a very popular tool. But anyway, going back now to the challenge, let me give you a couple of hints. Okay, so this is what the result looks like that I want you to build. But to help you a little bit, I will actually need to change you a bit of the code. So here in Change View, we can now switch to the editor view, which will then look just like what I showed you before. All right, so now we have the editors here on top and then the result down here. So there are some things I need to explain before you can get started. So first of all, I want you to wrap all of this content inside an article element. And remember how I mentioned that an article element can not only be used for something like a written blog post article, but also for like really a physical article. And so a shoe like this is a perfect example for that. So this is an article, and again, coming back to the example of having like an e-commerce store, then each shoe would be a different article. And so you would have one article element for each of the shoes, right? Then down here, there is an element that we have never used, which is this clickable button. And so down here, you see that this is simply the button element. And so you can just go ahead and use that. And then finally, there's something else, which is this symbol here. So this arrow here. Now, remember how back in our project, so here, I mentioned that this symbol right here, this copyright symbol, is an HTML entity, right? Remember that? And so this arrow here is just another HTML entity. And I also mentioned back then that there is a very handy list on my resources page, which is this one. Now, if you're watching this in the future, then this page probably looks quite different. But for now, this is what I have. And The HTML entity reference that I mentioned earlier is this one. So let's just open it up actually. And then there is a lot of stuff that you can use. So all of these different symbols. And here, for example, is the copy symbol that we used before in VS Code. Now, this is a huge list, and I'm just going to use a Command or Control F to search on the page for arrows. And here we go. So there are all these different arrows here, and the one that I used is this. So to insert this arrow into your own HTML code, all you have to do is to write this HTML entity. Okay? And yeah, I will leave this. Oh, well, actually, we don't need it anymore. Right. Oh, and just one more thing, which is the image. So you cannot really upload images to CodePen unless you have a paid account, but that doesn't make sense, I think. And so I actually uploaded the image for you onto this URL. So you see that this is actually another way of including images. So essentially an image that is coming from a certain URL. So in contrast, right here, when we wrote our code before, then the source was always an image on our own computer. So in this case, in the image folder, and then this image name. And if you're building this challenge on your own computer, then you can just use this challenge image here. So it's exactly the same. Okay, but if you're building it on CodePen like I'm going to do, then you will need this image that is located at this URL. So just copy this here somehow from the screen and use it for your own project. Then the dimensions of the image should be 250 by 250. And with this, I think I gave you everything that you need to know. So go ahead and copy this URL. And now I will switch to the full page view so that you can see everything at once. And now I will just leave you to it and come back here in 5 or 10 minutes once you are ready. Okay, here we are back, and I hope that it wasn't too much of a challenge for you, so that it wasn't too hard. So hopefully you got to practice your skills a little bit more. And so now, in case you have any doubt or you run into any problem, I will now show you my solution here. So as I mentioned, we are using an article here. And now for the heading, I used an H2, actually and not an H1, because of that idea of this being a component within a bigger page. Okay, and so each page should only have one H1. And so if we then have multiple articles, then each of them should just be an H2. So converse, Chuck, Taylor, all star. Well, I could have just copied this from the demo, but anyway. So IMG. And now I will actually go ahead and copy this URL here in the editor view. Okay. Then the alt text is just copying it now here. Oh, this should be enough like this. And then the height and the width at 250. And here it is. Here is our image. Great. Now let's go back here and actually copy all of this content. Why not? Then we can just, after that, wrap everything into its own element. So here we have the price, and I will keep using a paragraph for each of these elements, so for each of the text elements. Then we have free shipping. Okay. Oh, and you see that CodePen actually automatically did some indentation there. So that's quite helpful. Then here there's another paragraph. Right. So we are getting our content formatted, except of course for all the content that is not inside any element. So remember how I mentioned that HTML doesn't care about any spacing or about any enters. So like line breaks, everything is just in the same line. And so that's why we need to structure our content in a logical way. Now here we have that anchor element. And actually, I didn't really tell you where this link should point to. So you could have just created an empty link like this, basically, or you could have linked the Converse website. So let me just grab that link. So converse.com, probably. And I'm doing it like this. You will see in a moment why. And the reason is because we actually need this HTTPS : / so the entire URL. This is not necessary here. And now here let's close this. And here, of course, we do not just want this symbol, because this is not really correct. So instead we want that HTML entity that you hopefully used. So that is the right arrow. So this is the abbreviation here for R stands for right, and then R for arrow. And so indeed, this is the result that we got. Okay, so we have all of this part. Now let's take care of this list here and this heading. And finally, then also this button. So I have an H2 already up here, right? And so for this one, I'm using an H3 now. H3 and closing it. Nice. And now remember, in order to create a list, which is what we want here, so a bullet pointed list, we use the unordered element, or actually the unordered list element. And now we just wrap all of these into one li element, right? So I hope that at this point, you already know these elements. So you have practiced a lot, and so I'm sure that this is getting a lot more easy for you now. Let's just remove this dot here, and we are almost done. So all we need now is that button in the end. And so, as I showed you before, for that we can simply use the button element in HTML. So add to cart, and of course that button, so clicking that button will not do anything. For that we would need some JavaScript, but at least it is here visible. Okay, and we see here that we have 80 unsaved changes. So if you want to preserve those changes, again, you would have to save the CodePen and create a free account in order to do that. Oh, and I thought that we were actually done with this challenge, but there is one small piece missing. So this text here in the original is actually bold. So that's the only difference. So that's something that we're missing. And so let's simply wrap this value here, so all this text, into a strong element. Not string, strong. And you see, now at this point, we didn't close this tag, so this strong element. And so now all the rest of the content basically became strong. So everything is bold now because this element never ends. But of course, that would be a mistake. It wouldn't even be valid HTML, but the browsers somehow still are able to render it somehow. But anyway, with this, we finished this challenge and actually also the introduction to HTML section. So make sure to review everything that you just learned in this section, all your new skills, and then once you're ready, we can together move on to our next section, which will be the fundamentals of CSS. And so there you will finally learn how to actually style your content and make it look a little bit more polished and more beautiful. So that's really, really exciting. And so, yeah, once you're ready, let's move on there. See you soon.